Okay, so thanks everybody for coming along. This POLIRURAL Plus project, as we all know, it's building on the results of POLIRURAL. So I thought it would be useful if we just have a look back at POLIRURAL, remind ourselves of what we did, and also try to understand what are the lessons learned and what are the things that we'd like to bring over and maybe mistakes we'd like to avoid. So just, and some of you haven't been in POLIRURAL, so just to give you an overview, the general goal was to execute a policy planning process in 12 rural regions. So we referred to those as pilots. And they were only pilots in the sense that we were using them as a venue to develop and test out various IT tools and modeling tools. But other than that, there were real Foresight initiatives. They were a real part of everybody's local policy and planning process. So one of the things that we had to do as well in POLIRURAL was to use a strategic foresight approach. Now, some of you are familiar with Foresight and maybe some of you less so, but just to point out that there's often a confusion between foresight and future studies. So it often happens that a group of researchers, they get a contract to carry out some kind of a study on an important issue. They do the work, they publish it, and it becomes a report. But the general idea of foresight, it's really a management process. So it's much more than a future study. And in this case, the term is usually used in public policy, but it is used in industry as well. And it has a long history, more than 50 years. But the main reason for the POLIRURAL project was that we were going to experiment with the use of text mining tools and using natural language processing technologies. And the other thing is that we were going to use system dynamic modeling. So part of the work was to develop models that could be used by policymakers to support their decision-making, and also provide tools that would be useful to people who have complex cognitive tasks. You know, in Foresight, you have to create lots of documents. You do a lot of research, you create lots of documents, and this is a huge overhead for anybody who's organizing and managing a Foresight initiative. So on the one hand, we had this set of tools based on text mining that would be productivity tools for people working in local policy. And on the other hand, a decision support tool that would provide some kind of intelligence that people could use that would help them make comparisons between different policy options. So this is when we had the tools up and running, we started referring to them as like policy options explorers. And so you dive into the tool, and the general idea is that you could play around with parameters, and the different settings of the parameter would correspond to a policy option. And you could explore the impact that that might have on key economic indicators, like employment or per capita GDP or demographics, etc. So this was the general context of what we were doing in POLIRURAL. So it lasted 39 months. It ended in November 2022. So that's already quite a way away. You know, it's more than a year ago. And it involved 12 regions. Many of those regions are, again, involved in the POLIRURAL project. And we really learned a lot from it. But we also made some errors and omissions, you know, at the beginning of the project. And it's not to blame anybody, but you all know how projects get set up. It's usually a seat of the pants affair with people working late at night. The deadlines are too short and people are rushing to put together a proposal, and then you cross your fingers and you hope you get evaluated positively. So this is in fact what happened with the POLIRURAL project. And when we started, we were lucky to get positively evaluated. But when we started, we realized that there were lots of missing elements in the project. And so as a result of that, we had to have internal deliverables. We call them internal deliverables. And even though a large part of the work was about foresight, there was absolutely no foresight deliverable. So with a project over 3 years and a complex activity like foresight, we need to create a paper trail. We need to make notes and somehow capture the lessons And also we created a lot of tools and guides and inventories and stuff like that to actually help people in the execution of their local Foresight initiative. But I think one of the biggest gaps that we had is we had no design process for the development of the IT tools or development of the models. We just basically developed the model and then at the end hoped that it worked well. And we tried to correct that, to introduce, other tasks called design of experiment and introduce testing cycles and validation cycles. But in any case, these were things that we hadn't really foreseen, I would say, adequate resources and adequate time to do those things. But in any case, my impression is that, we're a little bit better placed in POLIRURAL Plus, but it's something we should pay attention to, that we have a proper design process and that we set aside time for testing and validating and for the design, understanding the needs of the users. As I said, I think we've got off to a pretty good start. Anyway, that was the main thing, was to use the policy process as a kind of a laboratory, a living laboratory, to test out these new tools. And we're not going to talk about the tools today. We'll talk about that in part 2 of the lessons learned on POLIRURAL, because it's just too big a subject. And when we get into talking about it, it distracts a little bit from the Foresight process and the policy and programming issues that we were dealing with. So that's what I want to focus on today. Now, the website is still up and running. So I would advise anybody, take a little bit of time, browse around the website. There's a lot of resources on the website. And what we'll do now is just, in explaining what we did in POLIRURAL, we'll point out where those resources are available and the stuff that you might find most useful. Because a lot of the resources on the website is work in progress, stuff that we were doing in the middle of the project, and maybe less relevant at this stage now that the project is finished. But bear in mind that there are lots of things on the website that we can use and will be useful for us. And we might adapt them a little bit. But nevertheless, a lot of the work has been done already, and it's available on the website. So the first thing I want to deal with is that when we started the project, it was just before COVID. And then COVID hit. So there was nothing in the design of the project or the initial planning that anticipated COVID, the fact that we would have to work remotely, and the fact that COVID and the COVID response would be an incredibly important issue that policymakers were struggling with. But the issue is bigger than that. After COVID, Unilever, which is a huge, retailer, not retailer, but producer of consumer goods. And they produce a lot of food related items. And so they work with farmers. And when COVID happened, they were very strongly hit with fluctuations in demand for different products. And the problem in retail is that the producers often work on very narrow margins. So if demand for a product falls, and if you cancel an order for a producer, that can have pretty catastrophic consequences for the producer. These guys usually operate with pretty narrow margins and maybe a time horizon of several months. And so if they miss orders for just several months, they are in real danger of bankruptcy. And the problem for a big company like Unilever is also, apart from what they might feel about their partners going bankrupt, is the fact that once demand picks up, if their producers have gone bankrupt, then they have to find and develop new producers. So this is a really tough issue that the companies like Unilever had to deal with. And they had to step in and look at ways of rescuing their partners and working with them, so not knowing how long COVID was going to last. So what Unilever did was they did a deep dive in the disruptions that are happening in this world and how there might be other forces driving changes to their supply chains. And so you'll see on the bottom left-hand corner, COVID is the smaller of these big waves. And this is what provoked the reflection of Unilever. And as a consequence of COVID, they were saying, you know, we're going to have an economic recession. So this is they put this down as a bigger wave, because with the economic recession, nobody will have money and they won't be buying things. And this will have a big impact on their bottom line and demand for certain goods. And then even bigger waves, there's the issue of climate change, a huge disruptor of supply chains, and the collapse of biodiversity. And this is something that, you know, scientists and people in the know have been talking about for a long time, but it wasn't really on the radar, not to the extent that climate change is. And it's interesting to note that this is the biggest wave that they've mentioned here. But anyway, the impression I want to give you is that we went into POLIRURAL thinking business as usual, another EU project, we'll work at it for 3 years, produce the results, etc. And we were immediately hit with a disruption in the shape of COVID. And then we were immediately confronted with the fact that maybe there'll be other disruptions coming along. And this has huge implications for policy, because it means that policymakers have to develop the skill to react to disruption and respond adequately and at short notice. And this corresponds to the whole issue of what we call resilience. But anyway, let's dig into this a little bit more. Over here on the right, there's something called the perma-crisis. It's a book by Gordon Brown and various other people, just to point out that since this, you know, study of Unilever, a lot is being written about the idea that we're in an age of permanent crisis. And so let's have a look at the kind of changes that we've had to deal with or ignore, as is often the case, because we can't deal with everything in the course of our POLIRURAL project. And ultimately, the kind of choices that local government is faced with, and not only local government, but government at member state level, and I dare say even at EU level as well. So on the issue of net zero, we've been talking a lot about it. So there's a big push to start producing renewables. And every region, every town, every city, every region of Europe is mobilized for the production of renewables and the creation of local energy systems. So this is a big policy item agenda that has been there for a number of years. But the number of regions that have been, you know, really embracing it is probably not as many as should. So some people respond quickly, some regions, and other regions respond with a little bit of a delay. And then there are other things like building renovation to make buildings more energy efficient. I mean, this is a huge issue. Energy efficiency, building renovation. Then there's something called RED. Now we're in RED 1, RED 2, RED 3. That's the Renewable Energy Directive, which puts constraints and sets targets for the production of renewable energy. And in the context of all of this, we had something called the Green Deal and another policy initiative called Fit for 55. And so in the Green Deal, this is a European level initiative called the Green Deal, and the Commission went to the member states and encouraged the member states to develop their own version of the Green Deal, to localize it so that the general idea of the Green Deal is going to be made more relevant to each member state. And in the meetings that I attended dealing with rural development, you had a situation where the Committee of the Regions and the DG Agri and various other actors were saying to the attendants, you need to develop a local Green Deal. So on the one hand, the Green Deal is something that starts at EU level. The EU is pushing the member states to localize it and come up with their own action plan. And then at the same time, through the Committee of the Regions, and they're encouraging the regions all the way down to the local administrative units, the smallest unit, to say, you need to come up with your own Green Deal. Don't wait for your government, the central government, to do it for you, basically because they're overwhelmed with too many things happening. Be proactive, come up with your own Green Deal. And this was linked to the Resilience and Recovery Plan and something called the Resilience and Recovery Fund. Now, the Resilience and Recovery Fund, all of these are things that happened during the POLIRURAL project. So we were going along, thinking that, we had certain tasks to do. And as we were going along, we were confronted with new tasks and new issues that needed to be addressed. And the biggest issue, I would say, with the Recovery and Resilience Fund, it was a lot of money. But first of all, you needed a plan to get the money. So that's extra work for policymakers coming up with a plan. And the other thing is that not only do you need a plan to get the money, but you'll only get a part of the money. So if you get, say, 10 million euros or 100 million euros, you have to come up with twice as much again from other sources. So you ask for 10 million, you get it, but only because you have a plan to find the other 20 million euros somewhere. So part of your plan has to be finding the rest of the money. And this is a real disruption to policy because at every level, it means that, first of all, at EU level, the way that happened at EU level is that the member states no longer had the money to put into the Recovery and Resilience Fund. There was a lot of discussion at the time, and the EU had to go to the international bond market, and they raised the money from the international bond market to finance the Recovery and Resilience Fund. The member states had to do similar things. They had to go and talk about PPPs. In the case of Belgium, they went to the international bond market, and in a couple of years, they raised about 10 billion euros to complete the financing that they were getting from the EU on the Recovery and Resilience Fund. So just to let you know that planning is suddenly, because of these disruptions, and more so than ever before, planning is as much about finding the money as it is about deciding what to do. And we'll come back to this again because it's relevant even down to the level of the smallest administrative units. And some of those who have been pioneers in this area, they have been quite proactive and finding the money. But it's not easy. And there are a lot of initiatives encouraging local level government to be more proactive in finding the money needed to implement the measures that they want in their own region. So anyway, COVID came along. We mentioned changes to living and working, transport, demand for services. All of those are big disruptions. Supply chain disruption, we mentioned Unilever, the bankruptcies. What do you do with small companies like cafe shops, restaurants, small producers that are being really messed about because demand for their product had vanished? And then, as if that wasn't enough, we had Brexit for people in, say, for Monaghan. Brexit was a major disruption to trade and patterns of investment, and certainly in the Irish situation. And also the war in Ukraine, which meant that the price of energy suddenly went up for a lot of people. This is the war in Ukraine, had a huge impact on the bottom line for everyone in Europe because of its impact on the price of energy. Then there were the climate change, the direct impact of climate change, wildfires. We had flooding in Belgium, crop loss. Water stress in the Danube created disruption to transport because the barges and boats couldn't travel in the river. In the Po Valley, the low level of water in the Po Valley in Italy has meant that there's now saltwater incursion, in areas that were once fertile, and now they have saltwater incursion. But all of this is happening in real time. It's a disaster, and you have to respond to the disaster at local level and help people out when they need it. Again, reacting very quickly to disruptions that nobody could have planned for or foreseen. And on the CAP reform, this is another major disruption we had to deal with. Why? Because we were in the sixth CAP reform. And as the project started, consultation on the new CAP was still happening. The EU was consulting with the member states and telling the member states, you need to consult with the regions. But this wasn't happening. I mean, the feedback from the partners was that we're not being consulted. I remember Marietta, was telling me, or it might have been you, Santa, but somebody was telling me that they got a 700-page document and had 1 week to react. And they were the good cases where there was a consultation, but in many cases, there just wasn't a consultation. And it's not, there's no point in getting into the blame game. The point is that these are major disruptions, departure from business as usual, and everybody was wrong-footed. They didn't really know how to deal with the situation. It was definitely a departure from business as usual, and the various processes were not in place. But the big issue about the CAP reform is that the EU no longer determines everything. The member states have to complete the strategy. So they get a framework for strategy, and the member states have to complete it. And this is one of the reasons why the Commission was telling the member states, don't forget to consult with the regions, so that the completion of your CAP strategy is not only adapted to national level, but to the local level as well. And we saw some crazy examples of a total mismatch between what was happening in agriculture and what was being done at national government, central government level, and what was being done at regional level. And there were lots of examples, say in Ireland and the Netherlands and other countries as well, where because of the lack of coordination, there was a mismatch. But the other thing in the CAP is that only part of the money comes from the EU. The member states have to find the rest of the money themselves. And to some extent, this has always been an issue, but it's just a bigger issue now and much more explicit. It is part of the reality that in the past on CAP-related issues, some member states would have dug into other budgets to complete their programming for rural areas. But now, the cat is out of the bag, and the Commission is saying to each member state, you've got to find the rest of the money yourself. So again, and on top of this, there's extra layers of need. So there's the soil mission. So now everybody has to start thinking about soil. There's the restoration of rivers and wetlands. There's the conservation of ancient forests, rewilding, restoration of ecosystems, etc. And it all comes home, all the detail is at the level of local government. So this really is the new normal for people working in local administration, is that they have much more to do, and not only deciding what to do in different policy domains, but they also have to find the money to make sure that needed initiatives actually get implemented. So all of this happened during the lifetime of the POLIRURAL project, and it's still going on. And in the middle of POLIRURAL, we had the announcement of the long-term vision for rural areas. So that was a good thing, because it was the first time at EU level there was a proper vision for what happens in the rural areas. For a long time, the EU had a vision for the towns and cities, but had no idea of what to do, clear idea of what to do for the rural areas. So now we have it. We're in the LTVRA, and it gave a framework for us, and it was released in the middle of POLIRURAL. So everybody who was working on their local Foresight pilots in POLIRURAL, in the middle, we did an evaluation of all the pilots, and we said, listen, guys, let's try and adjust our language and adjust our thinking so that we align ourselves with the long-term vision for rural areas. So that was another disruption within the project that we had to adjust to. So one of the major lessons, from this is that local administration is facing a kind of overload. There are so many things that are happening that local policymakers at local level have to deal with. And here, we're not just talking about regional level, but sub-regional level, and all the way down to, say, smart villages. This is what you might call the local administrative units. So nowadays, when the JRC is talking about regional development, the unit or the atom of governance is the local administrative unit, the LAU. And there are about 100,000 of those across Europe, 90,000 and something. So these are small entities, and in rural areas, they might correspond to what we call the smart villages and things like that. And already programs have been set up that cater to this unit of governance. But anyway, the job for the policymaker at a local level, obviously there are lots of choices that have to be made because they can't do everything. But they have to create policies at a rate and in a way that's unprecedented. CAP and recovery and resilience and all of the other things that are happening are requiring that they do so. It means that they have to coordinate the inputs and the contributions of different ministries. So there's this orchestration, everything happens at the local level. And so if there's a transport element, it means you have to be somehow dealing with Ministry of Transport at whatever is the appropriate level. You have to be dealing with the Ministry of Energy if it's about energy efficiency and transport. And you have to deal with the Ministry of Commerce if it has to do with trade. So all of these initiatives that could affect, say, trade, transport, energy, it's easy to see how they come together. And ultimately, it's the policymaker at local level that has to become the conductor, the orchestrator that is pulling on all of these different initiatives, trying to make sense of it at local level so that they get the outcomes that they need. And now, added to all of this, is they have to find the money and they have to execute the action plans, etc. And the message from the Commission is that don't rely on the central government to do these things because they're dealing with so many other things. They are overwhelmed as well. And so you need to get proactive, and the sooner you do it, the better. And so ultimately, this is why projects like POLIRURAL and POLIRURAL Plus are so important, because it's an opportunity to develop the tools that will make the impossible possible. In many ways, local government is faced with the impossible task of doing too many things. And over here on the right-hand side, I have a screenshot of a European initiative called, it's called, sorry, the name is covered over. So it's called Citizens or Staff for Climate, something like that. I'll send you the slides or I'll send you a link. But the idea is that, and this came out of the Covenant of Mayors, where you have about 10,000 cities and towns and villages across Europe have signed a climate pact under the Covenant of Mayors. So the Covenant of Mayors makes a model, and everyone who wants to sign it, they kind of adapt the model and they make a public declaration. We want to be net zero by such and such a date. And there are all of these initiatives, networking opportunities and funding programs to help them achieve those goals. But this has been happening with the municipalities and the towns and cities already. Nothing like this has been happening for the rural areas. And it's only with the Rural Pact and the long-term vision for rural areas that there's some kind of a catch-up going on. But it's worth knowing that under the Covenant of Mayors, a movement sprung up calling for more local staff because the cities and towns are just overwhelmed with all of the policy initiatives they have to deal with and all of the new things they have to understand and plan and finance at relatively short notice. So they're saying here, give cities the staffing means for their climate ambitions, and they have a manifesto. So there's about 50 or 60 regions in Europe have signed up this manifesto, mainly cities, etc. And another thing, so that's just to say that you're going to be short of staff. So that's a reality. And don't hold your breath to have enough staff because that's the last thing anyone in the public sector wants to do, is to increase the number of permanent staff in the public sector. Sometimes it happens, but you might get new staff on contract to do technical assistance. You might get finance for staff through projects, etc. These are all the mechanisms, but you're going to be under stress because you don't have enough staff. So again, the tools that we're working on ultimately are tools to help local administration deal with the stress that they're under, because they simply don't have enough staff, or if they do have good numbers, the staff don't have the right skills that they need to deal with the issues that are urgent. So just down below here, we have this Prospect Plus project. I've been talking about this a lot. This is an EU-funded project. I think it's Horizon, I don't know, is it Horizon Europe or Horizon 2020? But basically, it's a CSA, a training initiative, where they give training to local administration, teaching them about the new kinds of financing mechanisms that are available, that could be tapped into by local administration, and training them, first of all, to make them aware that they exist, and also teaching them how to work with those instruments. And now some of those instruments are EU programs or national programs, but other instruments are quite different. Some of the instruments are things like bonds, like climate bonds. So this is something that has become more and more common over the years, all the way down, not only for cities, but increasingly for regions, where the regions raise money from an organization like the EIB or the EBRD. And they raise money for development projects, but they raise it at the regional level, and they manage the money at the regional level as well. And that's a whole new skill that regions generally are not used to dealing with. They don't have the staff to do it. And also, they probably don't have the mandate to do it as well. So if they want to do this, they might have to change legislation. And legislation will enable them to act in this way. So this is an example of the kind of governance reforms that are, in fact, being aimed at under the LTVRA. So this is how, in the last, certainly the last 5 years, a lot of changes have happened. The work that we're doing in this project, and we were doing in POLIRURAL, is extremely important because it's about providing local government with the tools they need to do the impossible, in a sense. So I'll just mention what I wanted to say about the LTVRA. I think, Gabriel, you said you'd like to jump in as well and say something.
Yeah.
But I just want to, from the point of view of this project, I'll say my bit and then you jump in, okay? Yeah. So ultimately, there are, I have a list of some of the pertinent websites that we can look at. And so some of you are already very familiar with this, but some of you maybe not, especially if you have a more IT-oriented background and you're more interested in the tools. But I would say, nevertheless, it's worthwhile being familiar with all of this stuff because it's extremely pertinent for what we're doing. And we see it reflected already in the ideas that the different pilot projects of POLIRURAL Plus have put forward for the areas they would like to address. So there's 4 main pillars. And for me, the most important one is the idea that the rural regions are stronger. Now, what does it mean by being stronger? For me, this is a governance issue. And being stronger means that they're giving input to all of the policies that will affect them. And they're doing this proactively. And somehow they're finding the resources to do it. So maybe they combine resources with other neighboring regions or regions with which they have a shared interest. Or maybe they are getting extra staff through technical assistance. So technical assistance programs are a big part of the work under the Covenant of Mayors. I think there's an argument for technical assistance programs for the rural areas as well. And maybe this will come out through the Rural Pact. But the regions have to ask for it. But stronger means that they're really proactive in giving inputs to the policy processes. And one of the things that will happen during our project is that the consultation for the next CAP reform will start in the middle of the POLIRURAL Plus project. So one of the things that we could aim at is anticipating consultation on the new CAP reform and being ready with inputs to the new CAP reform so that your needs are adequately reflected the specific needs of your region. But the other thing about being stronger, I mean, they talk about engagement, et cetera, but all of the aspects of governance, you know, this is, for me, this pillar of being regions being stronger is all about the governance. So they have a much bigger influence on the policies that affect them. They're able to develop policies for themselves and implement them and even find the money to make them happen. So that's one way that you can visualize what is meant by, you know, rural regions being stronger. And then there's connected, resilient, prosperous, etc. Connected is just as much about transport links and road and rail and stuff like that, electric vehicles, as it is about digital connectivity. And COVID has had a huge impact on the way we see connectivity as well. But I won't dwell too much on the other things. Prosperous is about diversification of the economy, and resilience is really about levels of autonomy, you know, security in food. How much of your own food can you produce? How much of your own energy can you produce? And also, how robust are you from an industrial point of view in terms of the supply chains? When the supply chains are disrupted, do you have plans in place to help them survive and live through the bad times and maybe even come out better? But anyway, this is the context in which we're working. And I think that whatever specific themes you want to work on in the Polyrural Plus, say tourism, one region wants to work on tourism. Okay, whatever you want to implement in tourism, you will be faced with governance challenges. So the governance reforms, I think ideally governance reforms should be integrated into your action plan, because these governance reforms are general enablers, not just for the current action plan. So yeah, so this is the long-term vision for rural areas, and it's really putting shape and giving a structure to everything we're talking about. And all of the challenges are coming up, and it's useful to understand that many of the challenges we're looking at have already been addressed by the cities under the Covenant of Mayors. And they've been doing this for well over a decade, and they've put in place mechanisms, and there's a lot that can be learned from them. And I think this is an opportunity from working on the rural-urban nexus. You know, in our project, we're very much looking at links between the rural and the urban area. All the urban areas have food programs, you know, but where are the farmers? Food comes from the farmers at the end of the day. And so just on this, on energy, on waste management, on transport, you know, there's so many areas where there is an obvious need to work on the rural-urban nexus, but somehow, you know, people haven't always found the time or the opportunity to do this. And we will have an opportunity to do this, but it'll put us in contact with the programs that the urban areas enjoy. And it may open up opportunities for new ways of funding, new types of funding that we may be able to actually tap into. So the urban areas are better than we are, say the rural areas, at tapping into money from the EIB for funds for local development. But if we're working with the urban areas, we're in a much better position to say, okay, while you're applying for that fund and negotiating with the EIB, don't forget that we have funding needs as well. So we might be able to piggyback a little bit on the initiatives that have been, until now, primarily oriented towards the cities. But anyway, let's move on. Talking about foresight, I mean, now, you know, many of us are pretty experienced in doing foresight. I mean, I myself have been doing it for almost 30 years. For me, it's just a management tool, a strategic management tool and a change management tool. But then there are like technical elements to it. There's a social dimension, a social process. You have to combine bottom-up and top-down elements. But when you do this work, there is a huge burden of effort required to produce the documentation that will help people, you know, get on board, discussing issues, making decisions as you go along. So this really is the area where a project like ours and as was the case in POLIRURAL, can be really helpful. And so in POLIRURAL, we had some, training on Foresight, etc. There are lots of mechanisms and lots of tools to be used. So we'll come back to that later. But what I want to do is try to establish the general framework. And one of the elements that we said very early on in POLIRURAL is that, okay, guys, we refer to our local Foresight initiatives as pilots, but they're real policy exercises, and so they should have a real impact on local policy, and they should lead to real results in policy. And we cannot allow them to be derailed or hijacked in some case if we have a problem in developing software applications or new tools, etc., etc. So just to bear in mind that the pilots, when we refer to the pilots, they're only pilots from the software and tool development point of view. This is the piloting that's going on. But they are real policy initiatives, and that should have real policy impacts. And I think this is the case for most of us, the regions that are there. Most of you are really policy actors and very much involved in programming and the normal policy cycles. But the main thing is, so many projects I've seen and been involved in, Foresight just ends up being a report, a vision, or an action plan. For me, that is not success. If we have to have the action, otherwise we have not achieved our goal. The reason we make a plan is to implement it, and without the implementation, we've missed the mark. So one of the things that we did in the project POLIRURAL was we said, listen, we're going to produce a package which contains a vision, an action plan, and a roadmap. And in particular, the roadmap, it doesn't just deal with the sequencing of measures, but it says who is responsible for implementing the measures and where's the money going to come from? Because if you don't know those things, then nothing is going to happen. And to get the complicity of the actors in policy or in the public sector, you need to include in your process an activity that will get an endorsement of the vision and action plan by the beneficiaries, so that everybody says it's clear to the people in political life and public administration that this has general support. It's an important action. It needs to be implemented, and it has political support. And then the people in public administration responsible for the action, they have to adopt it. They have to say, yeah, we agree, this is within our means, and within the next programming cycles, it's going to be on the list of things to do. So you're already included in the programming. And also a monitoring committee. And the idea of the monitoring committee, its real value is when there's a change in government. Because often there's a change in government and, people, roles change, etc., and plans get lost. But if you have a monitoring committee outside of government, they can come back to the new government and say, listen, guys, this is our plan. It needs to be implemented, and we're going to hold you accountable. Just because there's a change of government, it still needs to be implemented. So these are elements, I made a big deal about them in POLIRURAL because they're easily forgotten. And I think these should be elements of our work going forward in the POLIRURAL Plus. And just as a reminder, on the website of POLIRURAL, there are all of these documents we created that are really useful. This we should go back to. And among the documents, there was an inventory of drivers of change, a guide to deep dives on the impact of COVID, deep dives on cap reform, deep dives on the Green Deal. The idea was that you have in a document something that gets you started quickly. You can pull out elements, share it, etc. And you don't have to do a lot of research, but it's oriented towards the work that you need to do. And then, of course, there were all kinds of other, ad hoc interventions as we went along. And again, as I said, this is really labor-consuming work, hard work, and you need clever people doing it that are intelligent and knowledgeable and have the time to do it. And so one of the things that we're doing in POLIRURAL Plus is using these AI tools to help us carry out this work and do it more efficiently. So there were other IT tools as well, and modeling tools, but we'll talk about that at another stage. It's just that we did develop documentation in POLIRURAL, and we can reuse this and maybe adapt it and do extra documentation in POLIRURAL Plus. So there were 12 pilots. There's a lot of information about the projects that were carried out. And on this slide, just to point out that there's a fiche on each policy with this quick resume of what happened in each pilot. And there's much more detailed information on the pilots. And we produce something called a compendium of Foresight initiatives. So there's a compendium where you can look at all the initiatives together. I think it's about a 50-page document, something like that. And then there's a short document, like 10 pages, summarizing the key lessons and recommendations that came out of the pilots. So these are things that I recommend anybody diving into a pilot exercise, have a look at this stuff as a reminder of what happened in POLIRURAL, and also for guidance as to things we can do under POLIRURAL Plus. Yeah. So there are a few things that are going to come up quite quickly. One is that we need I need to do a coordination meeting with the key partners in Work Package 3, so that we understand what we're going to do on the methodology and how we can help. And the broad elements of methodology, I think a lot of that is already well known, but we'll go over that. But maybe the whole area of methodology that we should focus on is really about using these new technologies and tools to help people be more productive in their work, in policy making. So, but anyway, this is a discussion that we're going to have, and it'll be informed by part 2 of our catch-up on POLIRURAL. But just as a general framework, the situation we live in right now is that climate change is getting more and more urgent. We need to go faster and do more. And as Gutierrez has said, we need to go beyond business as usual. So we're not going to get to meet our big targets if we just do the usual stuff that we do, maybe a little bit better. We need to go beyond that. And also at regional level, there's an increasing number of policy needs and unexpected disruptions. Disruption is going to be much more common in the coming decades than it was in the past. And how do we respond to disruption? So as it is right now, we have a kind of a long policy cycle. We took 3 years in POLIRURAL to do one cycle of developing regional action plans and visions, etc. I think it would be interesting to see if we can shorten that cycle and maybe do smaller, have smaller issues that we deal with, more focused, and complete the work or the cycle in, say, of the order of 1 year or less than 1 year. And so it means that rather than doing something really big and very burdensome, we do something smaller, and we use the tools effectively to help us get ahead in terms of productivity and effectiveness. But also, if we can do a few iterations on that, it means that we have more opportunities for improvement and learning the lessons, etc. Because in POLIRURAL, we went through the whole thing. It was 1 year. It was a huge effort, but we really had no opportunity to improve because we only had one cycle on it. So this, for me, is one of the things. If we can one of the things we have to produce are these regional action plans, but it's up to us to define what we mean by a regional action plan. And I think we can define it in such a way that we do several shorter cycles with lots of opportunities for learning how to use the tools, and also learning how to reorganize, the work of local administration so that we're better able to react to disruptions and maybe better able to respond to things that will happen, including consultation on the next CAP reform. But anyway, one of the things we didn't do in POLIRURAL, which I've done in a number of initiatives I've been involved in, is what's called a RIA, a review of institutional arrangements. And this is useful because, Thule, you mentioned it. If you're an actor low down in the hierarchy, your difficulty is, getting hold of the people in administration. But if you're in the middle of the hierarchy, you know, your difficulty is getting hold of the people a level up, you know. So this is the multi-level governance issue. And so it occurs in many ways. And we have what's called the vertical governance issue. And then there's a horizontal governance issue as well. And this quickly becomes complicated. But the idea of the review of institutional arrangements is knowing, well, who decides, you know, who has the money, who makes the decisions, where are they? And so on any issue, who do I need to involve? Because they are going to be either the influencers on policy or the actors that will implement policy, enact legislation, make budgets available, etc. So RIA, we used a lot of tools under POLIRURAL. I didn't make the RIA explicit. It was implicit in the way we worked. But I think what I will do is I will, let's start off with a RIA. It doesn't have to be big or complex, but the general idea is that it makes the system more transparent. And then we can talk in a more structured way about how to make the bottom up and the top down, you know, activities, how to orchestrate that or synchronize it better so that we're are more effective. So anyway, the next thing I'll organize a meeting on the part 2 where we focus on the tools. I have to do an internal meeting with the people who are directly involved in the work of Work Package 3, but clearly everybody is involved in the sense that Work Package 3 sits somewhere between Work Package 2 and 4 and 5, etc., and all of the regions and the pilots are involved. But we just need to have an internal meeting with us to get organized so that we understand how we need to interface with the rest of the project. So that's that for the moment. And if anybody feels that there's a need, you know, for extra training or information or stuff like that, let us know and we'll program it. And don't wait too late, you know, just as soon as you can, as soon as you feel the need, just let us know. And we'll try to slot this into the methodology work that we're doing as soon as possible. Yeah.